Visit us at Eduvvo. Thank you for calling Eduvvo.
Let's add a stateful widget. Now, which widget should be stateful? Right now we only have one widget, the widget in our main file. We could turn this into a stateful widget, but that would have at least two disadvantages, which are kind of connected. For one, it's already a pretty large widget. We have a pretty complex widget tree in there. And it is a good practice and good idea to split your large widgets into smaller widgets. That makes it easier to read them, to work on them, to maintain them. And also from a performance perspective, as soon as you start having stateful widgets that also rebuild when you change something, you should split your app so that you don't rebuild your entire widget tree just because a transaction changed. For example, here, the part where we handle the user input, that is where we get the data for the new transaction. But of course, this box up here doesn't change just because we added a new transaction. In this box, we don't show the new transaction. So there's no need to repaint this with every new transaction we added, or with every change in the transactions list in general. So it would make sense to kind of have that list of transactions in a separate widget. And therefore, let's create a new file here, which I'll name transaction.list.dart. Now, in addition, I now also wanted to make it really clear which files here are widgets and which files are normal classes. For example, the transaction.dart file is a normal class. It's not a widget at all. This here, the transaction class, serves as a model for our data. Therefore, here I'll create a new folder, models, and move the transaction.dart file in there. And if we had more models, if we had different types of data, different custom types, we would also add them here. In the main Dart file, I now also have to adjust my import here and import from ./models/transaction.dart because I moved that file in there. Now the transaction list on the other end is a widget, and therefore I'll also create a new subfolder, widgets. Now here I'll move the transaction list Dart file into the widgets folder. Now, of course, right now it might look a bit overkill to have two folders for only two files. But the more widgets we add, the more sense the separation makes, because it's then way easier for us to find out what's a widget and what's a model. So in the transaction list file here, I want to create a new stateful widget now. And for this, I'll use the shortcut here, this little snippet the Flutter extension gives me in Visual Studio Code, to scaffold out a stateful widget. It automatically creates the widget class and the state class, and it places a couple of markers where you can now type the name, and it inserts the name in all the places that need it. So here I'll name this transaction list using this Pascal case naming convention of having uppercase starting characters for the words, but having only one word altogether. Now in here, I need to import material.dart from the Flutter package because we're using stateful widget, which is exposed by that package. Also state is coming from there, and of course build context, the widget type, and the container type here. And with all of that, we have our base widget set up. Now in here, I want to manage my list of transactions. So with that, I mean my list of transaction objects. In here, we can therefore add a final list of transactions. And for that, make sure you add an import to your transaction model with ./models transactions. Because we need to go up one level. We're in the widgets folder. Tells start to go up one level, so out of the widgets folder, and then it looks for a new folder, models, which then exists in that lib folder in which we then are, and there in the models folder, it gets access to the transaction or Dart file. So then we have a list of transactions here, and I'll name this user transactions, any name you want. And initially, I'll have the transactions in here, which we previously had in the main Dart file. So let's grab these two transaction objects here, cut them in the main Dart file, and move them into the transaction list, like this. So now we have these two dummy transactions here to start with. By the way, if you're wondering why this is final, we will still be able to edit this list, as you will see. And I will come back to why this works and how it works in a second. So now we have these two transactions in here. Now in the build method here, I of course want to build that list of transaction widgets. In the main Dart file, I can get rid of that transaction list and also get rid of that import here from the models folder, of course. And if we scroll down to that error, which my IDE displays, this is the part where I output the list of transactions. This is the part which we can grab now, this entire column here, cut it out of the main Dart file and of our widget there, and add it instead as the return value in our transaction list here. Now in there, I'm accessing date format, and date format, on the other hand, requires us to import the Intel package. So we can remove that import from the main Dart file and add it here in the transaction list Dart file so that we can format the date. And transactions, that's the wrong property name. Here I renamed it to underscore user transactions, should be the name. So underscore user transactions, so let's use this here. Now we have the transactions managed in here, but now we'll face a new problem. We're adding transactions from inside our card here with the text fields, and that card is actually a sibling to our transaction list widget, which we would add here. So add transaction list here next to the card. That's why these ending annotations which the Flutter extension adds are really useful. So next to the card where you have your text fields. And of course, to use the transaction list widget here, you have to import it from /widgets transaction underscore list .dart. But as I just said, we now have a problem because in transaction list, we have our, list of transactions. And this list should change. But the change is triggered by our text fields, which reside in the main Dart file. So what can we do about that? Well, in the end, we have to do something which is called lifting state up, which means the common denominator of our text field card here and of the transaction list, so the one widget where we use them both, is of course still our My Homepage widget here. So there actually is no way around managing our state, our transactions in here, because we need to add a new transaction to that list from inside our text fields here, or with the help of our text fields. And then we need to pass that down to the transaction list, which is nice for outputting our transactions, but bad for managing them, because if we manage our transactions here in transaction list, then we have no way of accessing the user transactions list here from outside of that transaction list widget. The problem just is our text fields here are not inside of the transaction list. So of course we could alternatively also take that card with all the text fields and add it to our transaction list. That would work, but I actually prefer a different approach. Let's add two new widgets. One for our text input area here, so for the card with the text fields, simply to make that main widget tree a bit leaner. And second, let's then put our text input widget, which we'll create, and that transaction list widget, let's put that together into a new third widget, which we then use here in the main widget, in the My Homepage widget. The advantage of this will be that the My Homepage widget can stay stateless, and things like the scaffold and the app bar aren't rebuilt just because we added a new transaction, because these things really are not affected by a new transaction. The parts that do need to interact with a new transaction, so our text input card here and the transaction list, will then live in a separate widget. So let's add two new widgets, as I just said. One is the new underscore transaction Dart file, which will hold our text fields. And one is the user underscore transactions.dart file. In the new transaction.dart file, I'll create a stateless widget, which I'll call new transaction. And in here, as in all your widget files, you need to import material Dart so that you unlock stateless widget and so on. Now let's go back to the main Dart file and grab that card with all the text fields in there. So this entire card here, grab it, cut it, remove it from the main Dart file, and return it here in the new transaction file. Now we have the amount and the title controller in here, so let's add that. Let's add these properties in the new transaction widget. The title controller is a text editing controller, so instantiate that and store it in a final property. And the same for the amount controller. That's the exact same step we did in the main file earlier. So now this works. Now in the main Dart file, we can simply use our new transaction widget here, instantiate it, and add an import at the top. Again, my IDE automatically added one, and whilst this would work, the recommended syntax actually is to use this relative import syntax with /widgets new transaction in this case. And now we have a leaner main Dart file. Now to avoid having to manage the state in here for these two widgets, where actually at the moment my homepage is the common denominator, to avoid having to manage them here, we have that new user transactions file here. That will now hold a stateful widget named user transactions, where, as always, you have to import material.dart. And now here, I actually want to use my new transaction and my transaction list widget. So the goal here is to return a simple column with these two widgets. Actually, basically what we have here, a column with these two widgets. So you can cut the two widgets here from main Dart file, and therefore also, of course, get rid of these import statements there. And instead, in the user transactions file, return a column, because we want to have two widgets sit on top of each other, hence we need a column. And in that column, add these two widgets, and of course also add the imports. So import /new transaction dart and import /transaction list.dart. Now we can manage our list of transactions here in the user transactions state. So in the transaction list Dart file, we actually don't need a stateful widget. Instead, let's use a stateless widget here. And that means we can get rid of this part of the create state method here, and then also of our state class. Cut that list of transactions here. Leave the build method in here, of course, we still need that. But now go to the user transactions file and there to the user transaction state and add that underscore user transactions property there. Here I'm also using the transaction type, my transaction model. So we have to go out of the widgets folder to the models folder and then import my transaction Dart file here. Now we're almost there, but now we need to pass user transactions to the transaction list widget here. And you'll learn how that works. So feel free to do it on your own. We'll do that and a couple of other things in the next lecture.